Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Hi. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this evening's program, The Power of Trees. Tonight, we will find out just how much trees contribute to your daily life with our presenters, Juliet, Cain, and Meaghan Hetherington. I want to take this time to thank our community partners for this event, the Darien Nature Center, the Darien Land Trust, and the Darien Pollinator Pathway, who have helped to make this program possible. Thank you. Stay tuned. At the end of this program, Darien's very own first selectman, John Zagrodzky, will be giving away these beautiful native trees behind me to 5 lucky recipients in the audience. If you haven't received a ticket, please raise your hand and we will make sure you get one. Before we begin, I would like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this possible and our collections available to the community. And now, on to our presenters for the evening. Juliet Cain has been a resident Darien for almost 20 years. Since retiring from the practice of law in New York City, she has focused on environmental issues. She served on the Policy on Resilient Forests for Connecticut's Future Working Group for 2021 to 2022, and on the CTGC3 Climate Smart Agriculture and Forestry Working Group in 2022. She was the chair of the Conservation Committee of the Garden Club of Darien and zone representative for the Conservation Committee of the Garden Club of America from 2020 to 2022. Juliet is an accredited organic land care professional certified by CT Northeast Organic Farming Association and is a co-founder of the Darien Pollinator Pathway. The Darien Pollinator Pathway seeks to eliminate the use of pesticides and to restore pollinator populations through mature native plantings, and with grant funding has undertaken several tree planting projects in Darien. As former chair of the Darien Beautification Commission, Juliet spearheaded the native plantings at the Darien Town Hall. Thank you. Meaghan Hetherington is a psychoanalytically trained psychotherapist. In her clinical practice, she works with adults and adolescents experiencing a range of emotional, mental health, and life issues. Meaghan draws upon a range of clinical theories and knowledge, including mindfulness-based stress reduction to promote emotional health and well-being. Meaghan practiced therapy with Wellness Insights, a Darien-based multidisciplinary collaboration of healthcare providers. She has lived with her family in Darien for 7 years and has served as a member of the board of directors of the Darien Nature Center for 5 years. Meaghan is particularly interested in how nature promotes physical and emotional health in people and how people can take better care for the environment. We welcome Juliet, who will speak first, and then Heather. Please hold off on questions until the end of the program. Welcome, Juliet.
Well, hello, everybody. It's been a long time since we were supposed to speak here in January, but you can see our trees are now in leaf. Well, as Joanne said, our talk tonight is called The Power of Trees, and we're going to be looking at the essential role that trees play in our everyday lives. And that's a role, I think, that can often be overlooked or underappreciated because our lives are so busy. And nature and trees aren't really usually involved in our day-to-day activities. So every now and again, I think it's really good for us to step back and think about all of the amazing services that trees provide us and what we, in turn, might be doing to help protect and preserve and to enhance our tree canopy. So we'll look at what these services or benefits are, and we'll look at some of them anyway. This slide has a good number of examples. It's not exhaustive, but we wouldn't have time to look at all of them anyway. And we'll break these down into 3 categories: social benefits, economic benefits, and environmental benefits. And we'll look at a few examples in each category. So by social benefits, you can see it's all pretty social. I think there are a few of you on this slide. By social benefits, we tend to mean the mental and physical health benefits that we enjoy when we are around trees. Think about what it's like to go to the DCA Bird Sanctuary, for example, or Selleck's Wood. You feel an immediate sense of calmness and peacefulness. And that has a very positive effect on our minds and our bodies. And Meaghan is going to be talking about those benefits in more detail in her talk, I Am the Warm-Up Act. So trees also make our communities more attractive and more pleasant places to live. And they give us a sense of place. Trees are enduring. We expect to see them. Many of them were here before we were born, and many of them will outlive us. And a good example of this was last year in Plymouth, England, when the local government decided that they were going to take down 110 mature trees along the shorefront in the middle of the night to make room for a development. Well, 2 months later, that government was voted out of office. Now, you may say that's a coincidence, but I think it's testament to the strength of feeling that communities have about their public trees. Now, turning to economic benefits, by economic benefit, we usually mean a kind of direct return on investment, and that's not an entirely inappropriate concept here because trees are our capital assets. And a couple of examples on this slide come close to being that sort of more direct return on investment, but it's important to understand that all of the services that trees provide can be valued. Maybe it's reduced healthcare costs, maybe it's reduced energy costs. And the EPA and other organizations calculate those values in relation to the cost of maintaining a tree over its life in the region of 3 to 1. So I'd say that's a pretty good investment. And then, I think this is interesting, I hope you do. Recently, the Biden administration has been looking at how to incorporate these eco-service values into GDP. Now, gross domestic product is normally just a measure, well, I shouldn't say just, but it's a measure of our economic progress, economic growth. But I think if we can take into account the value of these services, we'll start to make perhaps better decisions. So, for example, if you take into account the value of services that trees are providing, maybe you will make a decision not to take those trees down. Maybe we'll steward the land better. Maybe we'll decide we can have clean water from natural sources instead of going to the expense of having to build a treatment facility. Sorry, GDP always makes me thirsty. Okay. So going back to the examples on the slide, when we landscape with trees, we tend to improve our property values, and not just our values, but those of our neighbors too. And it's my understanding that on Littlebrook Road right now, some of the residents are contesting their property tax assessments on the basis that they feel, as a result of the handiwork of Eversource in clear-cutting, felling so many trees a year or so back, they feel their property values have declined. And then studies show that where you have a treescape downtown or retail area, you attract visitors and they stay longer and they shop, which can yield more commercial income. So turning to environmental benefits, I think these are best seen in the context of urban trees. And I don't just mean inner city trees, I mean trees that line our streets as well. And in this urban setting, they're going to be more exposed to heat and pollution. And so the benefits they provide are going to be magnified. So now you all know about carbon capture because there's a lot of talk about this now. So trees draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and they mix it with sunlight and water to create the energy that they need to grow. And this process of photosynthesis also releases oxygen into the atmosphere. So if you just had to choose one benefit that trees provide, I mean, this would be a pretty major mega benefit. We can breathe because of trees. Now, all plants perform photosynthesis, but it's the scale that we're talking about with trees that makes it so significant. And they don't just draw down that carbon dioxide, they store it. They store it in the trunk, the branches, the leaves, and it's stored in the soil around. We'll come back to the concept of the symbiotic fungi in a little while. Now, trees also provide cooling services, and this is a somewhat dramatic slide. It comes from the Arbor Day Foundation, and that twig on the left is actually supposed to be a mature tree. So you'd be surprised, yes, 100 leaves are the equivalent of 1,000 air conditioners. But you know what it feels like to go to the city on a hot day when the buildings and the sidewalk and the road have absorbed all the heat from the sun, and then those buildings, that built environment just radiates it out back at us. And so the temperature is much, much higher as a result of those built-in surfaces. And that's called the urban heat island effect. But once you start to put trees in place, you start to shade the building, the road, the sidewalk. And it's not just the shade that causes cooler temperatures. The leaves of the tree evaporate water, and that also creates a cooling effect. And then trees filter particulate matter. That's like smoke and soot and dust that's in our atmosphere. And trees next to a road will filter the particulate matter that's in vehicle emissions or road dust. And this can have a very beneficial effect, obviously, for people who suffer from lung disease, asthma, for example. And the city of Stamford actually found that the documented cases of asthma on the urban west side of Stamford were around 8 times as high as cases in the more rural North Stamford. And you could say, well, of course, because the west side is going to be polluted. But what it says to me is that if we can start to plant and look after more urban trees, then we're going to start cleaning the air, and maybe we'll have improved outcomes. And then trees also provide stormwater management services. So when rain falls, let's say it's a big storm, the rain falls onto a tree canopy, that rainfall is dispersed over the canopy of the tree. It's dispersed over a wider area. And when it touches the ground, it's going to fall on soil that has been aerated by the tree roots. So these pockets of air can take the water that's falling and hold it. Now, if the storm, the rain is severe, there will be excess water, but the roots of the tree act as a sort of filter. So the rainwater is able to be filtered by the roots so that contaminants, gas or pesticides or trash gets left behind. And the slower flow enables that cleansing. And those roots also perform erosion services too. They hold the soil in place. Now, if you compare that with rain falling on an impervious surface, by definition, that water isn't going to be absorbed. The surface is impervious. So in a very heavy rainstorm, the water will accumulate, and eventually there'll be flooding, and there's the speed, the rate at which that water flows is so fast that there's nothing to filter it. So the trash, the contaminants, all go into the storm drain. And it's my understanding, it may be different in different places, but the water that comes from a storm drain isn't usually treated, so it will run straight into the closest water course. Now, I know I said I wanted to talk about environmental benefits in the context of urban trees, but let's not forget the importance of trees along our coastline. I think it's really important that we maintain our canopy for all of the reasons that we've just discussed, but in particular these stormwater management services, the flood mitigation, the erosion control. Our shoreline is vulnerable, our shoreline is receding, and we are subject to more and more storms, and they're more severe, and we have storm surges and sea level rise. Now, I'm not opposed, of course, to any engineering or technological solution. I'm just saying, don't remove the natural solutions. Just use the technology or engineering to supplement what we already have. Okay, so before you read this, I'm going to go back. So you can't read it. What have we described? We've described an air conditioner, a carbon sink, an air filter, a water filter, stormwater management services, and I've forgotten one, carbon sink. Basically, now you can read it, if you wanted to invent the most effective kind of climate management technology from the ground up, you could spend a lot of time trying to do that. You would just engineer a tree. Now, this was a quote that appeared in a fairly recent New York Times article that was describing the measures that Singapore is taking to help cool its city-state. And those measures largely involve incorporating trees into every aspect of their urban planning. And you can see from this picture that they're including trees and greenery into their building design too. Okay, you didn't think you could come to a talk by someone from the Pollinator pathway and not hear about native trees, did you? But native trees go one step further. Of course they do. All of the benefits that we've described so far are provided by all trees to a greater or lesser extent. But it's our large, mature trees that provide the bulk of those services. So the city of Hartford, when it was researching for its tree ordinance, they concluded that it was 12% of their trees that provided 50% of the benefits. So it's not a linear proposition. And it was those mature trees that were providing those benefits. So native trees, I say they go one step further. They go one step further because they improve biodiversity. What do we mean by native trees? We mean the trees that were here before the European settlers came. So they haven't been introduced, they haven't been manipulated or cultivated in any way. They're sort of in their natural state. And because they've been here so long and grown up here, they don't need fussing. They don't need extra fertilizer. They don't need extra water once they're established. And they improve biodiversity because they support our local species. Now, many of our local species are specialists, which means that they can only be supported by maybe one or a handful of plants. So the monarch's relationship with milkweed is probably the best known example. The monarch can only lay its eggs successfully on milkweed. So no milkweed, no monarchs. So I want to give you a comparison between a native tree and a non-native tree. And this is one of our native dogwoods, Cornus florida. And it supports around 117 different species of moth and butterfly. And its non-native counterpart is the Japanese dogwood, the Cornus kusa, which supports monkeys. Now, don't get me wrong, I have nothing against monkeys. It's just that they don't have any role in our local ecosystem. So why do we care about biodiversity? What does it mean? And why do we care if we have a tree that supports 117 moth types, as opposed to a tree that is waiting for a monkey to happen along? Well, if it's not already apparent to you that I'm not a scientist, I'm about to make it abundantly clear. I have a very simple example of biodiversity that I think will explain the more erudite sentence at the start of the slide here that is from Doug Tallamy. And my example, I start with a bird. A bird is a pollinator. It moves pollen from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower that allows reproduction of the flower, fertilization, fruit, seeds. And what does that bird eat? Well, among other things, it eats insects in the ground. And what are those insects doing? Well, those insects are breaking down organic matter. They're chomping and chewing, and they are excreting, nutrients into the soil. And they're moving around beneficial fungi, so it's all in the right place. And you may have heard of mycorrhizal fungus. And that fungus is one of the symbiotic fungi that we just saw. And the fungus receives energy from the tree, from woody plants generally, and in exchange, it donates nutrients to the tree. So there's a lot of activity going on here, and I'm just describing a couple of things. There are thousands, millions of microbes and insects in that soil, and they are creating a very, very healthy soil. So I'm assuming no chemicals, no pesticides. This is nature at work, and nature knows best. And a healthy soil is critical for photosynthesis. And what does photosynthesis do? It gives us oxygen. So we need these insects. We need these pollinators. It's all this perfect circle. And we want that circle to be strong for our own sakes. And the way to make it strong is to have as many species as possible, diversity of species, and the highest populations possible within each species, because that way our circle is less vulnerable to threats like invasive pests, invasive plants, disease, climate change, prolonged periods of heat and drought. And we've seen already, these plants, our trees, are providing oxygen, they're providing clean water. And don't forget, the work of pollinators provides 30% of all of the food that we eat. It isn't Trader Joe's, it isn't Whole Foods. It's pollinators. And before I move to the next slide, I just want to give you another example, because right now it's springtime. And in the spring, birds are looking for caterpillars to feed their babies. Caterpillars are nutritious for the babies. And just one clutch of chickadees, tiny birds, needs about 6,000 or 7,000 caterpillars to survive. So if we have a tree, let's say like the dogwood, that hosts lots and lots of moths and butterflies, then we will have caterpillars, because that's an early stage of the moth and butterfly. And we need enough caterpillars to feed the birds, and we need enough caterpillars that will evolve into moths and butterflies, so augment the pollinator species that we described, just the bird. Now, I don't want to over-egg the whole dogwood thing. The reason for using it is because we get to put up a picture of the monkey. There are many, many native trees that provide equal or greater host services, and the most important is probably the oak. It's the most productive. So what happens when we lose species? Now, this slide is sort of funny and not funny, isn't it? I don't put it up to scare you, just to sort of show you the importance of those interrelationships and how dependent we are, how every cog in that wheel, that circle that I described, which is meant to describe an ecosystem, how critical that is for us. So we've described, let's say, the ultimate climate mitigation tool, and we've described a massive contributor to biodiversity. So I think it's time to look to see how our trees and forests are faring in Connecticut. Well, the good news, I'm trying to be upbeat here. The good news is that around 59% of our land cover is forest. Around 191 million metric tons of carbon is stored in our forest land. That's an area defined as at least 1 continuous acre. Carbon stored has increased by around 9 million metric tons over the past decade, and our forests are the most carbon dense in the Northeast. And then a constitutional amendment in 2018 requires a public hearing and a 2/3 vote of the General Assembly before any public lands can be sold. Now that's a very important point, because when the budget wasn't balancing, it was very easy to go out and look for the family silver to sell off. Now this is a barrier to sale, it's not foolproof. So the less good news, the bad news, is that our forests are aging. And I think that explains why our carbon storage numbers are increasing, because as those trees age, they store more carbon. And what that also says, though, is that we are not planning for the future. We're not replacing those aging trees, because if we were planting continuously and looking after our trees, we would have we'd have a younger tree canopy, a younger forest. So this is bad. And then our largest forests are becoming fragmented, which creates more forest edge. The picture on the top right is supposed to show how you've gone from deep, dark forests to light intruding, and light is going to encourage invasive plants, invasive species, which don't host any, they basically don't have any biodiversity contribution whatsoever. And we have low per capita spending on land conservation, and individual owners have low interest in active forest management, and most are 55 or over. And that's not surprising because it's hard work. But what it means is that there aren't the tax or financial incentives to encourage people to steward their land, or actively steward their land. And there aren't the estate tax incentives to be able to transfer the land to a younger generation. And then most of our population lives in urban areas, and that's only going to increase. And most of these areas have inadequate urban tree cover, especially our lower income, vulnerable neighborhoods, which we refer to as environmental justice communities. And Connecticut has among the highest disparities between income and tree cover. That's tree inequity. And then the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's 22 report says that New England is getting hotter faster than the rest of the US. The really bad news is that our forests are facing multiple threats. We've mentioned climate change already. Prolonged heat, drought, floods, very, very severe. We talked about trees being the ultimate climate mitigation tool, but they're vulnerable as well. And then we've mentioned invasive species. We have a perfect storm here. That picture in the top right-hand corner is the tree of heaven, and it's host to the spotted lanternfly, which is causing all sorts of damage. And so, yeah, it couldn't be better for that fly. We have commercial development, which sees fragmentation of habitat, breaking up of habitat. And then my own bugaboo is the ongoing clear-cutting by the utilities and the DOT. They used to prune, and it wasn't pretty. They left trees in very strange shapes, but it was some canopy. And now we have more of an indiscriminate approach to just cutting down anything that's remotely near an overhead wire. And this is what we experienced in Darien as a result of Eversource, DOT, and some commercial development. I think it's looking a little bit better now, but that's how it was at the beginning. It's pretty ugly. So what about the General Assembly? Is there anything happening at the state level that is addressing all of these issues? We've seen so many issues that need addressing. Well, in 2023, a number of bills were introduced that would have addressed the clear-cutting by utilities and DOT, and they essentially required that the utilities and DOT replant whenever they cut down trees. And none of those bills passed. Now, my advocacy group and I tried to get those bills reintroduced in 2024, and we failed. One bill that is a very positive bill, it's an act now, was passed, and that was to increase the tree canopy in environmental justice communities by 5%. And the work on that is ongoing. It's started and is ongoing. But 2024, the session was a short session, I think the shortest in several decades. It only ended yesterday. So I have to say, I mean, I sound like I'm very negative, but I was really optimistic. I put this bill down, HB 5004, because I thought it was going to pass, and it didn't. And I'm not that bothered because I'm still feeling a little sore about our bills not getting passed or even introduced. And the reason I'm not is even though I was looking at nature-based solutions to climate change, conservation of forest land to augment carbon sequestration, it actually all started with yet another report. And in my view, we've had many, many reports, and it's time for action steps. And I'm kind of skirting over the DOT vegetation management guidelines because they've been allowed to write their own, and to me that's fox and hen house, so it's not terribly interesting. And so I'll just cover this briefly. On the topic of clear cutting by utilities, because this issue hasn't been addressed, we still have this conflict. We've got our overhead wires and we've got tree canopy. And in my view, the only solution is to underground those wires. And the Public Utility Regulatory Authority, which is the regulatory body for the utilities, has an open docket on resiliency, and one of the items they're considering is undergrounding. But you can see from these dates that nothing much is going on. So, I come back to this. What can municipalities do? Well, we've seen that action in Hartford isn't fast and furious, so there's a natural gap. But I also think that decisions about our local natural resources are best made locally, based on local knowledge, local needs, local input. And I'm not saying that municipalities can legislate for DOT or the utilities. That's something that the state has to do. But they can take steps that make their communities more robust, more resilient in face of these threats. So let's look at what some of our neighboring towns are doing. Many of them have tree city status, and this is a program that was started by the Arbor Day Foundation, and it requires a tree ordinance, protective tree legislation, a tree commission to oversee that ordinance, a minimum annual budget of $2 per capita, so not much, and an annual celebration of Arbor Day. And I think that the ordinance is really key here. And my favorite ordinance, I'm sorry, I have a favorite tree ordinance, is Hartford. Because Hartford is blind to where the trees are located. They protect trees whether they're on public land or on private land, and they have a whole permitting process. And then Greenwich has a very interesting ongoing tree canopy inventory and assessment that is being done by the tree warden, and it's being paid for out of the capital budget. But for municipalities that don't have that kind of budget, there are multiple grant opportunities. In addition to private opportunities, there's lots of federal and state money kicking around right now. Norwalk received $1 million from the USDA's forestry program last year. New Haven's received $3 million. And Bridgeport received a state grant from the Connecticut Department of Agriculture, $200,000, to plant Miyawaki microforests on 7 public school sites. And a Miyawaki forest is a very dense plantings of native trees, and because they're so densely planted, they compete with each other for the soil and the light and the water. So it's sort of a Lord of the Flies in the forest. It's survival of the fittest. So the strongest ones grow, and they grow very quickly. It sounds sort of weird, doesn't it, kind of like an instant forest, but they were started in Japan to combat huge polluted areas, industrial areas in Japan, and have been very successful. So I think they may be the way to go. And I think they've just planted one on Roosevelt Island in New York too. So this is another slide from the Arbor Day Foundation. It shows that if you have municipalities that really take care of the public trees, it gives people a sense of pride in their communities, and that inspires them to take better care of their own trees, which gives them an even greater sense of pride, and then a willingness to volunteer. So you've got another beautiful circle here, where you have more people willing to help take care of the public trees. So I think there's partnerships that can be built here with individuals, with our nonprofit, environmental organizations, and I think there's a lot we can do at the municipal and individual level. So I will leave you with this thought. This is a lovely, eloquent quote. "In the end, we will conserve only what we love. We will love only what we understand, and we'll understand only what we are taught." And that was a quote from Baba Dium, who was a Senegalese forestry engineer, and he was addressing the UN in 1968. And I say to you, an equally august audience, but far less eloquently, that for all the reasons we just looked at, we just can't afford to sit on our assets. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming tonight. It's so exciting to see so many of you in the audience, eager to hear what we have to say, and thank you, Juliet. It's really wonderful. So if I were to prescribe to you and your family a powerful intervention that could lower your stress, boost your immune system, improve your cardiovascular health and your longevity, reduce your anxiety and improve your mood, reduce the risk of mental illness in your children by up to 55%, improve your working memory, boost learning, school performance, and creativity, and enhance your social connectivity, would you take it? I'm not talking about Ozempic, by the way. I am talking about time around trees, of course. Now, this is not a new prescription. In fact, it's been around, and we've known about it for millennia. What is new is the extensive body of scientific evidence that proves just how powerful being around trees is for our health and well-being. And I'm excited to share some of the research about just that tonight. But first, a personal anecdote. This beautiful street is in Park Slope, Brooklyn, where my family and I lived before we moved to town. And every day, my 3-year-old son, who's sitting across the room over there, on his way to school, would ask if we could take this particular street on our route. He called it Calm Street because of the trees. We all innately know that being around trees is soothing for us, right? But somehow along the way, in our rush to get to where we need to go, we lose sight of that. So I'm hoping to give you perhaps a bit more motivation tonight to find Calm Street in your life. Because trees are essential medicine, benefiting multiple dimensions of our health and well-being. I'm going to begin by talking about my area, the benefits to our mental and emotional health first. So Juliet very eloquently told us how trees help to cool our environment. They also cool our inner world. Trees help to calm our nervous system. In fact, even after only 5 minutes of exposure to trees, our parasympathetic nervous system kicks into action. Our parasympathetic nervous system is associated with rest and relaxation. It balances out another branch of our nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, which was associated with fight or flight. It's really helpful to have this balancing system. But the reality is that many of us walk around with an overactivated sympathetic nervous system and a heightened state of arousal that we don't need, right? So we have a readily available resource right around us to help boost our parasympathetic nervous system response. So research has found that exercising in forest, standing or sitting looking at trees induces this physiological response, reducing blood pressure and lowering our cortisol and adrenaline levels. Even looking at pictures of trees has a similar but less dramatic effect. I have a lot of pictures of trees in my presentation tonight, so I think you all made a very good decision, for many reasons, to be here. So we are innately predisposed to find non-threatening natural stimuli relaxing, right? This is innate. It's hardwired into us. Trees help protect us from stress we haven't even experienced yet. So research has found that trees buffer against future stress. A Dutch study of 4,500 residents showed that those who had the higher levels of green space within a 3-kilometer radius of their home reported fewer health complaints, a better general sense of their overall health and better perception of their mental health after experiencing a stressful life event. For the purposes of this study, a stressful life event included a death in the family, a divorce, losing a job, legal problems, serious issues, right? But these people managed these realities of life in a much healthier way. I should say that this analysis, the study, controlled for age, gender, income, education levels. These kind of controls of factors are in all the studies that I will talk about tonight, even if I don't mention it. So trees have also been found to be an effective treatment for depression. A University of Michigan study asked clinically depressed participants to think about an intensely negative, unresolved issue in their life prior to taking a 50-minute walk, either around an arboretum or around downtown Ann Arbor. So these poor people were primed to feel really terrible, right? These are clinically depressed participants ruminating on something really awful in their life. In fact, the researchers were a little concerned about how this was going to go for the participants. But what they found is that the participants who took a walk around the arboretum had reported less mental distress and less negative mood, so they were feeling better, right, after taking the walk around the trees, even though they thought about the negative life experience to the same extent as the people who took a walk around the urban environment. So this suggests that walking around trees supports a more adaptive response to, again, the negative realities that we experience. So it wasn't that they were tuning it out and forgetting about their problems, but they were better able to handle their problems by being in the company of trees. The effect sizes for this study, meaning the power of this, was actually 5 times as great for the clinically depressed participants as the effect size for other studies within healthy individuals. So this also is important and says that, for those who are depressed, it is really very important that they have access to nature as part of their treatment. For healthy individuals, trees are also mood enhancers. And so several studies have similar findings to the Michigan study, where participants report positive mood, less negativity, less anger as a result of their time around trees. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, roughly 20% of Americans experience an anxiety disorder in the past year. And so that's 40 million American adults. That doesn't include children, adolescents, or the adults who don't meet the clinical criteria for a disorder. So anxiety affects a lot of people. Many of us know what it feels like. And fortunately, being around trees can be very helpful, particularly in dealing with rumination. So rumination is kind of compulsively focusing on one's own negative thoughts. Why did I say that at dinner last night? I'm such an idiot. They're going to hate me. And rumination itself is not a mental disorder, but it is a symptom of many, and it also predicts the onset of anxiety and depression. And so if we're able to address rumination, you are kind of taking care of prevention, right? You're helping to alleviate even risk of developing anxiety and depression. And this is consistent with this fascinating study that showed that trees offer a protective factor from mental illness for children. So this was a Danish study of nearly 1 million people, and they found that those who had the highest level of residential green space around their childhood home had a 55% lower risk of developing mental illness in adolescence or in adulthood. It's incredible. They looked at 16 different mental health disorders, and there were protective factors found for the trees against all of them. 55 was the highest rate, however. But this really shows that children need exposure to green space early and often, right? So the research showed that there wasn't a particular time that was more beneficial. It was really the cumulative effects. And so for some certain disorders, it was especially helpful at a given time, but basically we want that access throughout childhood. Not surprisingly, perhaps, because we feel better around trees, we are also nicer. Many studies show that being around trees builds empathy. There was a study that showed that elementary school children were nicer to one another and even to strangers after visiting a nature school than after a visit to an aviation museum. And this reinforces a lot of other studies, right, that says that we feel more open to social connectivity after being around trees. Okay, I hope you will bear with me for a moment here. We're going to do a little visualization exercise. I promise it won't hurt. So if you will, please, feel free to close your eyes if you'd like. Otherwise, I have a visual aid in this Danish painting. I'd like you to imagine a large tree in a storm, right? We've had plenty of storms this spring. The winds are howling. The tree is swaying. The leaves are kind of blowing about. Maybe some are flying off. Now imagine how many storms that tree has experienced over the course of its lifetime. It's many. And when that tree was a sapling, it relied upon those winds to help to strengthen and expand the root system underground, right? So the wind helped that tree to grow so big and strong. It needed the stress of the storms to help it to develop. Now think, if you will, of a time where you have experienced an intensely stressful experience in your life, and it helped you to grow stronger. Perhaps it showed you that you can be resilient and do hard things. Okay, now, if your eyes are closed, please, I hope you will open them again. I'm going to tell you why this is super important. Trees need stress to grow stronger, and so do we. And reframing your stress as something that makes you stronger can help save your life. Bear with me. A University of Wisconsin study showed that having a lot of stress in your life and believing that it was taking a major toll on your health increased the risk of your premature death by 43%. It was not the experience of the stress alone, but believing that it was terribly bad for you that increased the risk of dying early. So it is really important for us to think of ourselves like a tree in a storm, right? That stress makes us stronger. It does not have to kill us. Incidentally, if anyone happens to be reading the anxious generation. Jonathan Haidt uses the same metaphor. I don't know when he wrote that chapter, but I wrote this chapter of this page a long time ago. He hasn't called me, and I noticed the book is a bestseller, but... So what is the right dose? So basically, a scoping review found 10 to 50 minutes in natural spaces was found to be effective to improve mood, focus, and physiological markers like your blood pressure and heart rate. I told you earlier that you can see an effect after only 5 minutes. So if you have 5 minutes, use those, right? And of course, there's a benefit to cumulative time, right? So if you're able to spend at least 2 hours per week, you're going to feel much better, according to this study in the UK. What about in winter? So as Juliet mentioned, we were originally scheduled for January. I might have had a harder time convincing you how good it is to be around trees when the trees look as they do on the photo on the left. This photo is taken from a study conducted in Poland, and the one on the right is taken from a study in Finland. Fortunately, the restorative and positive effects of time around trees are year-round. So even these poor guys on the right from Finland, these undergrads, they were standing outside in January in Finland. It was 19 degrees. They had to stand at a distance where they weren't able to interact with one another. Of course, no devices to distract them. They stood outside in the cold and the snow for 15 minutes staring at a tree. They all felt better as a result of that, right? So you can too, especially on a spring day like today. Okay, so moving on to the benefits to our cognitive health. I don't know if this will be surprising to you, but our attention spans are getting shorter. We've gone from an average attention span in 2004 of 2.5 minutes to about 47 seconds last year. And that's not even if you're talking about the median. The median is even uglier. There are good reasons for this, right? There's good reason for this. There are powerful forces working, right, to ensure that our attention is never really our own. Why does this matter? It matters for a lot of reasons. But for our purposes, more frequent attention switching increases our stress physiologically. We feel it, our heart rate goes up the more we're doing. It can inhibit deep thinking and learning, and also deep connection interpersonally. And decades of research has shown that multitasking is associated with poorer decision-making and slower performance. Distracted living fragments our attention. We feel this, right? We know this. The more distractions we have, the more mentally fatigued we become when we attempt to focus on something. Our directed attention is a finite resource, right? And it can be depleted pretty easily because it requires a lot of effort to tune out all these shiny distractions. And we have a lot now, right? Just, for example, I made that image using AI. I didn't even know that was a thing you could do. I lost a lot of time playing with that. It's pretty cool. But there's that's a pretty shiny object to be pulling me away from research. And yet my attention is finite, just like everybody else's. And so neurologically, humans have not caught up with today's overstimulating environment. We're just not there. Fortunately, time around trees, are a simple antidote to this. This is a really important part of trees' benefit to our mental and emotional health. Many studies have shown that participants perform better on memory and attention tests after exposure to green space. So that can be true whether you're walking around in Arboretum, but it's also true in urban environments when study participants walk by 10 trees on one block, so they're walking down Calm Street, or they're walking down an urban street with no trees. The benefit is also seen to any access to trees. So this is so important that there's a whole theory around why this is the case, that it's called nature attention restoration theory, and so that nature provides us with enough, it's called soft fascination. So it's enough attention to make us interested, but it doesn't deplete our directed attention. So we don't have to focus too hard. And this is really restorative for us, cognitively, right? So I'm offering you a prescription tonight. This is specifically if you would like a mentally revitalizing walk, right? I love my social walks. This is specifically if you feel like you need some rejuvenation, right? You're feeling a little depleted. So we're talking about going to a gentle environment where you can walk without having to concentrate too hard on what step you're taking next, right? We're not hiking the Grand Canyon, we're walking around Great Island, okay? And when, hopefully pretty regularly. It's kind of like when what we tell runners, by the time you're feeling thirsty, you're already a little bit dehydrated, right? If you're noticing that you're feeling cognitively depleted, you are, right? And so ideally you're doing this alone, so that you're not having to really respond to some stimulus, and also without your device, right? I mean, if our phones distract us when we're sleeping, obviously it takes a toll when we're awake as well. So the rejuvenating effects are seen in children too. So students who have a view of a classroom, from their classroom, have views of greenery, perform better on concentration tests. This is especially helpful for children with information processing issues, behavioral problems, or ADHD. In fact, scientists have found that a 20-minute nature walk was equivalent in terms of the benefits to the peak effects of 2 typical ADHD medications for children, right? So they're getting the same boost in concentration levels from taking a walk outside as what we're giving them for medication. Of course, if we're better able to focus and concentrate, we're going to do better in school. So it's wonderful that Bridgeport is taking this action, because tree cover has been positively correlated with academic performance in math, reading, including in low-income populations. So this is, again, controlling for socioeconomic factors and other important elements that we know affect our students' performance. That's my niece snoring, so I'm not going to take it as a snub. Okay. So nature relieves stress and restores focus, and both of which promote learning. Thank you, Helena, for giving me an example of a distraction and, right. Okay, so there's a lot of talk and I think increasing attention about moving, from screens to green time. I'm curious, just a quick show of hands, how many people climbed trees when they were growing up as a kid? Yeah. For those of you who are parents, how many of your children climb trees? No shame. Yeah. It's just a kind of a simple joy that has been lost. And actually climbing trees is really good for us. There's many benefits. It stimulates problem solving, creative thinking. improves our motor skills, and I think it's something I think is really important, because this is a broader issue, is that risky play is healthy for kids, right? Kids need to understand how to negotiate risk and to see that they can do hard things, right? It cultivates a sense of self-efficacy that's really important, and there's a lot of other ways in which this has been lost in our current parenting world. Okay, quickly moving to our physical health. Trees benefit our cardiovascular health. They have been shown to promote physical activity. So time around trees actually makes us want to exercise more. And when we do exercise around trees, there's more benefits to us. So there's more rejuvenating effects, right? And better mental health benefits if you're exercising outside than if you're exercising inside. Time around trees correlates to improved sleep patterns, and as I've already said, reduce blood pressure. All of these things kind of interact synergistically to offer protection from many issues, including coronary heart disease and stroke. So there's a lot of ways in which trees enhance our immune system, and one of the ways that's quite direct is through phytoncides. And so trees release these medicinal aerosols, especially in old growth forests, and they have antibacterial and antifungal properties within them. So we actually, when we breathe them in, it helps us to fight diseases that we may be facing. So Japan has done some research about the cancer-fighting benefits to forest bathing, which is what this is all about. And there's been 5,000 species that have been identified so far of these phytoncides. A very famous study from the 70s actually showed that post-operative patients who had a view of a tree from their hospital bed recovered faster, took fewer painkillers, and basically had fewer complications than those who didn't have a view of a tree from their window. And also, this is important, adult women living with the highest amount of green vegetation around their home had a 12% lower rate of non-accidental mortality. So ladies, trees help us live longer. Guys too, but especially pronounced for women. And it's the accumulated time rather than concurrent time. So, as Juliet also alluded to, trees can make communities safer. In Chicago, for every 10% increase in tree canopy cover, the crime rate decreased across several categories. It's really incredible. And in Cincinnati, they had the inverse. So the emerald ash borer, an invasive beetle, wiped out these ash trees. And so this was associated with an uptick in property crime, violent crime, and assaults. It's really quite incredible. And finally, we know, especially at the Nature Center, that direct contact with nature is the most effective way to grow environmental stewards. So if you want your children to grow up to care about the environment and be motivated to protect the environment, the most important thing you can do is encourage a love of nature, encourage wonderful time outside. And this is more beneficial than even telling them why it's important to recycle or why we need to preserve water, right? Okay, so in closing, what is the good of your stars and trees, your sunrise and the wind, if they do not enter into our daily lives? So as I started, I hope you will consider how you can find your way to Calm Street. Thank you all for coming. We're all in big trouble if staring at the computer screen will kill us. But actually, standing next to you is a great resource for this kind of information. Dr. Katie, with whom I have Dr. Katie Takayasu, with whom I have the pleasure of practicing. Katie is an integrated health physician in town. Of course, there's a lot of different things that go into our health and longevity, and certainly, being active, being outdoors, and social connection there's a lot that goes into it. I haven't seen research that necessarily correlates so directly with, X time indoors and screens results in, this kind of impact to our overall longevity. That may be out there, but I do not know about it.
Okay, well, that is a really good question. And I think it would be great if we could become a tree city. And some of you are probably familiar with the fact there was a Yukon study that was done a few years ago that showed that our temperature has increased around 10 degrees in the past 20 years. And the West, familiar with Westcog, it's the administrative body for municipalities in the western part of Connecticut. And they've done a couple of studies that showed that Darien had one of the highest impervious surfaces and one of the lowest tree canopies. And that was before Eversource came to town and before we had all this commercial development. So I don't know where we stand right now. So I think that the need is definitely there. My conversations with successive administrations have been that there's generally a reluctance to have a law, an ordinance in town, but I actually think that you could mimic the benefits of having a tree city status, because you could have a commission, you could have spending, you can have, anyone can celebrate Arbor Day, and you could somehow mimic with appropriate procedures and policies some kind of structure that would be something that the town could follow, that could be articulated, that residents could see. And so I think if there is this deep-seated reluctance to have an ordinance, you could do something that comes pretty close to that. So I leave it to you. No, don't talk. Well, I'd say it's better than not having 14 trees. I wouldn't cut them down just because they aren't hosting moths and butterflies. Because they provide presumably other services, and if they cut them down and put in natives, they're not going to replicate that size. So you wouldn't get the non-native benefits. But if you have a free choice and you've got this space to plant, then I would hands down choose a native tree. And the important thing is to remember that if you're selecting a number of trees, you want to have diversity of species too, because as Meaghan was talking about the emerald ash flora, if you just decide you're only going to plant ash, then that is a smorgasbord for your pest. So you want to confuse them. They want to hit the first ash and then say, whoa, I don't eat eastern redbud. Tree of heaven, because first of all, it smells. And second, it smells when you break it. And that's how you know. So it looks very much like the sumac. So don't just get rid of anything that you think is a tree of heaven. Break the branch, sniff it. You'll know because it stinks. And do what you can to get rid of it. Now, the problem is that the slightest little bit of root that you leave it'll just come back. But if you have the energy and just keep going. At some point, you should be able to conquer it, and particularly if you plant over it, plant a native fir over it, plant a big native tree to take it out. The next issue is disposal, though, because if you put that in with all the other brush, then the seeds or the roots will just take hold. They'll get nice and warm with the other things, and they'll just grow wherever they're thrown. And one of the suggestions that I had with one of my working groups was that the municipalities set aside an area, a segregated area that's covered preferably for invasive plants. But it's a lovely idea, but it's very hard because not everybody knows what's what, and you're always going to have people making mistakes, and then, it's a thought. I mean, if you have enough room where you can just isolate your pickings and just, keep them somewhere yourself, to keep them out of the regular brush, that would be great, but do what you can to get rid of them. Yes, I mean, I think any decision to remove a tree, you really, really have to think about it, and especially the mature ones that are providing so many of these benefits. And I think all of us need to think about that. Maybe we don't love this tree, but just think what it's doing. And if you just tear it down, because there's no prohibition on doing that, and you just put in I hate arborvitae, but anyway, an arborvitae. I'm sorry. I mean, they just look like soldiers, don't they? All in a row like that. To me, they don't even cast shade. I mean, shadow, yes, but not shade. So anyway, I would think about that.